For decades, the story of the Titanic was built on conflicting memories because no one could see what was left on the seafloor. Then the first detailed scans and clear images arrived, and several certainties changed. Debris scattered for miles, and subtle marks on the hull told a cleaner story than the accounts from 1912 ever could. Tonight, you'll see 7 discoveries that only surfaced decades later. Before we begin, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me to the end of the investigation. For decades, the Titanic was reconstructed mostly through survivor testimony and technical assumptions made from far away. That created contradictions. People in different parts of the ship witnessed different moments, in different orders. Without access to the site, many conclusions became official simply through repetition. Modern investigation treats the disaster like an archaeological site, where metal, debris patterns, and damaged geometry act as documentation. When physical evidence enters the frame, it doesn't erase testimony. It helps organize what fits the engineering and the real-time sequence. Once expeditions finally reached the North Atlantic sea floor, the story gained a new kind of source: direct images and measurements. Sonar and submersible vehicles made it possible to locate major structures in a massive, dark landscape. With every descent, what appeared on screen wasn't just a lost ship. It was a spread of preserved, twisted, scattered pieces. The work demanded route planning, controlled lighting, and continuous logging, so positions wouldn't be confused on the bottom. That method turned old arguments into testable questions. Mapping the site isn't only about finding the main hull, it's about understanding what surrounds it and how everything is distributed. Grid sweeps reveal anomalies that could be ship structure, cargo, furniture, or fractured sections. Each confirmed target becomes a reference point, allowing the map to expand with consistency and control. Orientation matters too, because the relative positions between sections and objects help reconstruct the sequence of events. As the map sharpens, patterns emerge that no one in 1912 could measure: distances, alignments, and debris trails. One of the longest debates was whether the ship broke apart before it vanished or sank in one piece. In 1912, visibility was limited, the night was black, and stress can warp memory. Conflicting accounts were dismissed as exaggeration because there was no way to verify them. Modern investigation doesn't rely on "it seemed like." It looks for break signatures and edges, deformation, and most of all, separate major sections. When you compare what people said to what was found, many contradictions become something simpler: different vantage points, seeing different moments. The first major discovery confirmed by seafloor imagery is that Titanic broke in two before it fully sank. What was once treated as rumor or confusion gained physical proof. Two main sections, separated by distance. The edges and damage pattern point to extreme stress. At the moment, the bow was already deeply down, and the structure exceeded the hull's limits. That also explains why some survivors described intense sounds and violent vibration in the final minutes. This evidence doesn't depend on memory. It's written into the metal. Confirming the break is only the beginning, because the seafloor shows it's not just bow and stern. Between the two main sections, there's a trail of fragments stretching like a corridor. That transition links the ship's structural story to what happened during the descent. Pieces detaching, objects being dragged, water and momentum rearranging everything along the way. For analysis, each fragment is a process marker, not a standalone curiosity. The result is a scene that explains why the disaster was more complex than a clean sinking. The second discovery is the true scale of the debris field. It spreads for miles. That reach suggests disintegration happened while there was still motion, and in multiple stages, not only after everything settled on the bottom. Lighter objects and smaller pieces travel differently than heavy sections, creating distinct dispersal patterns. When you measure that distribution, you can infer directions and phases of separation. And it reshapes many old accounts because different groups may have witnessed different events, just seconds apart. When investigators look closely at joints and fasteners, they find a detail barely discussed in 1912: rivet performance under cold and load. In some areas, weaker material may have deformed or failed, widening openings that pressure had already started after the scrape with ice. That doesn't point to a single clean gash. It suggests multiple vulnerable points working against the ship at the same time. The analysis combines hull imagery with sample testing and failure pattern comparisons. This is what engineering looks like when history becomes observable. Structural failure is rarely one isolated point. It tends to propagate along predictable paths. Under stress, plates can buckle, rivets can loosen, and small separations between seams can grow. That mechanism matters because it connects the initial damage to a chain of water ingress across compartments. What looks minor in one area becomes critical when it repeats across a long stretch of hull. By tracing deformation and aligned damage, modern investigation reconstructs how the problem multiplied instead of concentrating. A cascade, not a single wound. The fourth discovery clarifies the impact itself. It wasn't a head-on collision. It was a glancing scrape that produced a series of deformations. Instead of one continuous cut, evidence points to multiple smaller openings across different compartments, adding up to an inflow that was almost impossible to contain. That detail changes the logic of why there wasn't time. The challenge wasn't sealing one breach, it was fighting several at once. If you want to follow the next pieces of evidence with this same technical level, hit like and subscribe, because what comes next shows how science measures what was invisible in 1912. From here, the investigation links those deformations to the real behavior of flooding inside the ship. The watertight compartment concept depended on one thing: keeping water limited to a small number of sections. When a lateral scrape opened multiple entry points, the technical teams faced sequential infiltration, not a single concentrated breach. Watertight doors, valves, and pumps helped, but every minute shifted the weight balance inside the hull. Modern analysis shows that small openings added together create a volume no pumping system can truly offset. From there, the ship responds like a system: heavier bow, steeper angle, and water advancing into areas that had been safe. On the bridge, the night imposed practical limits: low visibility, few reference points, and decisions made with incomplete data. While officers assessed the situation, instruments and logs had to translate a reality changing below decks. The challenge was coordinating distant sections, engine control, watertight closures, and deck preparation. Reconstruction suggests that at this stage the ship still seemed functional in many areas, which delayed public awareness of the risk. The early list was subtle, but enough to signal that flooding had already begun to affect stability. The central discovery in this part comes from modern simulation. With water entering multiple compartments at once, sinking stops being a possibility and becomes a physical consequence. Current models combine internal geometry, inflow rates, and weight distribution to rebuild the real pace of the process. The result shows why containment has limited impact once water advances in a chain along the hull. As the bow drops, the waterline reaches new openings and accelerates the progression. This is where inevitability becomes measurable, not just dramatic. Once the angle increases, the ship enters a domino effect. Internal routes change, doors become harder to use, and objects begin to shift. Even before the list becomes extreme, it alters human behavior and crew efficiency. That helps explain why accounts describe different sensations in different areas. Some spaces still felt stable, while others already dealt with water and structural vibration. Evidence and models converge on the same point. Useful time shrinks fast once multiple compartments are compromised. From here, operational priority moves toward evacuation. Command had to balance two fronts: keeping the ship as controllable as possible and organizing procedures on deck. Internal communications and engine adjustments depended on mechanical instruments, handwritten logs, and routines trained for emergencies. Reconstructions show a bridge working against the constant backdrop of the Atlantic night, with few visual cues for what was happening below. In that context, decisions rely on indirect signals: list angle, compartment reports, and the ship's behavior in the water. The bridge doesn't see the flooding, it interprets its effects. In the machinery spaces, the work was physical and technical at the same time, keeping power, steam, and pumping online as water advanced. Valves were cycled, lines were isolated, and pumps were repositioned to buy minutes. The core limitation was simple: pumping capacity can't match an inflow distributed across multiple points, and as water accumulates, the center of gravity shifts and the ship lists more. Complicating movement and access. That effort helps explain how the ship kept some lighting in function for part of the timeline, even as the outcome was already turning irreversible. On deck, launching lifeboats was a procedure that demanded sequence and control. Covers removed, falls organized, davits operated, the boat steadied as the ship moved. Night and wind added friction, and the growing list changed the geometry of the work. Evacuation isn't one single moment. It happens in waves as awareness spreads and as boats become ready. What matters here, for later discoveries, is that human movement begins to draw routes. Some points collect lines, others become bottlenecks. Those patterns leave material traces, even when memory breaks down. As evacuation grows, the ship becomes a map of flows. Corridors, stairways, and doors begin to shape collective behavior. Differences in access and distance to the boat deck create repeated paths and accumulation zones. The list, even if gradual, influences practical choices: where to stop, where to go, and what to carry. In this kind of dynamic, personal objects start separating from their owners, not by chance, but by urgency. Later, on the seafloor, those trails help reconstruct how the last minutes were lived in motion. The sixth discovery comes from evidence that doesn't rely on memory: personal items preserved on the seafloor. Shoes, buckles, and small cases appear in patterns that suggest movement routes and areas of crowding. These objects don't tell stories on their own, but they help trace where people moved when time started running out. When you cross their locations with the site map, coherent corridors and gathering zones emerge, consistent with the evacuation's progression. It's a material record of human motion, etched into the place where the ship finally ended. In the final minutes before the break, the list stops being a detail and starts commanding the ship's behavior. The bow is already low, and the weight of the water creates stress that rises with every change in angle. Procedures on deck continue, but the environment becomes unstable surfaces, strong wind, and more frequent structural noise. This is the phase where objects break loose, routes change, and the separation between safe and critical areas becomes obvious. Modern reconstructions use this interval to show why the break wasn't a surprise to physics, even if it felt like chaos to those aboard. The first discovery confirmed the break. Here, it gains operational context. The failure happens when structural stress crosses the limit. With the bow pulling down and the rest of the hull resisting, the midsection deforms progressively until it gives way. The result is separation into two main sections, disputed for decades and confirmed only when the seafloor was documented with clarity. This moment also explains the later debris distribution and why accounts differ depending on where people stood. The break isn't a clean slice, it's cascading structural failure. After separation, the sinking sequence continues in a consistent order. The bow had already descended, and the stern remains afloat longer before its own final fall. The aft section reaches steep angles, loses stability, and begins its last descent. That order matters because it helps interpret the debris field and the energy involved in the drop, which influences where pieces end up on the bottom. Physical evidence, paired with simulation, supports this progression without relying on conflicting versions. What we see today is the final result of a sequence governed by water, weight, and structure. When investigators return to the site, one thing becomes clear. It's not a frozen monument. Structures collapse, railings vanish, and surfaces break down over time, changing what each expedition can observe. Documenting the ship demands repeating routes, comparing footage, and logging what changed from one year to the next. That turns Titanic into a rare case, archaeology under a countdown. With each campaign, the priority is to capture detail before it becomes unrecognizable. The seventh discovery involves a biological and chemical process that is literally consuming the ship. Microbial communities and deep-sea reactions transform steel into fragile structures, accelerating degradation. That helps explain why some areas appear to melt into irregular forms and why entire sections can collapse between expeditions. The implication is direct. The wreck won't last forever, even at extreme depth. That's why every recent documentation run has the value of historical record, not just curiosity. When you put it all together, the break, the debris field, material behavior, the impact pattern, and flooding models, public understanding of Titanic changes in a measurable way. Many old debates were simply the result of limited access and limited technology. Today, physical evidence lets you separate hypothesis from verification, reshaping what's likely, what's possible, and what's not. Myth turns into scale and precision, distance, direction, rate, and sequence. The story isn't rewritten by opinion, it's updated by data. Titanic didn't reveal its secrets all at once, and even now, it keeps changing on the ocean floor. These 7 discoveries show how technology, science, and documentation turn scattered memories into a coherent line of evidence. More than a century later, the ship remains an accidental laboratory, engineering, archaeology, and human behavior under pressure. At the same time, degradation reminds us this physical archive is temporary. What endures is the method. Observe, measure, compare, and record before the deep erases what's left.
This video recreated a historical atmosphere with AI, based on period records and a dramatic narrative.